Some prisons are built to hold people, others are built to remove them from memory. In the United States, there are facilities where the sentence is not defined by time served, but by how completely a person can be erased from ordinary life. These are places most Americans will never see, rarely hear about, and almost never question until something goes wrong. And even then, the story usually ends quietly. This chapter is not about a single prison name yet. It is about a category of punishment that exists between legality and neglect. Because before someone is sent into one of the worst prisons in America, something important happens. They stop being seen as someone who will return. The American justice system speaks in formal language. Sentences are issued in years. Facilities are labeled by security level. Placements are described as administrative. But behind that language is an unspoken reality. Some people are sentenced with the assumption that society will never have to deal with them again, not because the law says so, but because the system behaves as if it's true. These are the prisons where failure is expected, not prevented. Most Americans imagine prison as harsh but structured, a place with routines, work details, maybe education programs, and some path, however narrow, toward release. That image exists, but it does not apply everywhere. In the worst prisons, routine exists only to maintain control. Programs are scarce or symbolic. Human contact is limited not as punishment, but as policy. Medical care is reactive, not preventative. Mental health treatment exists mostly on paper. Time stretches differently here. A day is not something to complete. It is something to endure. The first shock for many people sentenced into these facilities is not violence. It is silence, a silence enforced by architecture. Concrete walls thick enough to absorb sound, steel doors designed to close without echo, corridors built long and narrow, limiting sightlines and movement. Windows, if present, are positioned to prevent orientation. No clear view of the outside world. No sense of time passing. Light becomes artificial. Air becomes stale. Space becomes minimal. Environment does not invite adjustment. It demands submission. Placement into these prisons is rarely explained in full. Officially, it is about security, risk assessment, classification scores, disciplinary history, and officially, it is about manageability. You can be isolated without political cost. You can be placed out of sight without scrutiny. Who will not generate public sympathy. Once assigned, transfer out is unlikely. Not because people fail to improve, but because improvement is difficult to measure in isolation, and isolation itself creates the behaviors used to justify keeping people there. This is where the sentence quietly changes. What begins as incarceration becomes containment. Movement is restricted to strict schedules or eliminated entirely. Meals are delivered through slots. Showers are timed and supervised. Recreation, if allowed, happens alone in enclosed spaces barely larger than the cell itself. Human interaction is minimized, not as a disciplinary response, but as a default condition. Weeks pass without physical contact. Months pass without meaningful conversation. Years pass without touch. The brain does not experience this as neutral. Without regular stimulation, it begins to distort reality. Thoughts loop. Memories replay uncontrollably. Sounds feel louder. Silence feels heavier. Small changes and altered routine. A delayed meal. A different officer trigger intense reactions. Emotion becomes unstable. Some people grow hyperalert, scanning constantly for threats that rarely appear. Others shut down entirely, conserving energy by reducing feeling itself. Neither response is voluntary. Both are adaptive. Yet within the system, these reactions are often interpreted as defiance. A person who paces is seen as agitated. A person who withdraws is labeled incooperative. A person who struggles to follow orders is punished for noncompliance. The environment creates the behavior. The behavior justifies the environment. The loop closes. Medical care in these prisons operates under constraint. Requests are screened, appointments delayed, symptoms evaluated through security lenses. Pain must be visible to be treated, and sometimes not even then. Chronic conditions worsen quietly. Mental health care is particularly limited. Counselors rotate. Sessions are brief. Privacy is minimal. Treatment often means medication without therapy. The goal is stability, not recovery. As long as someone is not disruptive, the system considers them manageable. Family contact becomes a complication rather than a priority. Phone calls are monitored and limited. Visits, if allowed, occur behind glass or via video. Physical presence is replaced by digital representation. Over time, relationships thin, conversations become repetitive. News from the outside feels unreal. Life continues without shared experience. For families, grief begins long before death. For those inside, connection becomes something remembered rather than lived. Education and rehabilitation programs, the cornerstone of correctional philosophy, are largely absent in these environments. Group classes are considered security risks. Work programs are limited or non-existent. Skill development is not prioritized. There is no preparation for release because release is not the assumption. The system is designed for maintenance, not transformation. Public awareness of these prisons is limited by design. They are often located in remote areas, far from major population centers. Access is controlled. Media visits are rare. Oversight reports are written in technical language that obscures lived experience. When incidents occur, deaths, lawsuits, investigations, they are framed as isolated failures rather than systemic outcomes. The structure itself remains unquestioned. And yet, these prisons continue to operate year after year, not because they are unknown, but because they are tolerated. They exist within the law while functioning beyond public attention. They serve a purpose that is rarely stated aloud, to hold people in conditions severe enough that society no longer has to imagine a return. This is only the foundation. Because beyond isolation and neglect lie facilities where violence, overcrowding, corruption, and medical collapse converge, places where survival itself becomes uncertain. And those prisons have names. The moment someone enters one of America's worst prisons, the rules change, but not on paper. Officially, these facilities operate under the same laws, policies, and constitutional standards as every other prison in the country. Rights still exist. Procedures are still documented. Oversight still claims to function, but in practice, survival becomes informal, not guaranteed, not protected, just tolerated. In these prisons, violence does not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it grows quietly. Overcrowding turns cells built for one person into spaces holding two or three. Tension rises as privacy disappears. Noise becomes constant. Sleep becomes fragmented. Irritability becomes unavoidable. Correctional staff are stretched thin. When supervision drops, power shifts. Not officially but realistically. Informal hierarchies form among prisoners. Control is enforced through intimidation, debt, and threat. Weakness is noticed quickly. Illness is dangerous. Mental instability becomes a target. Protection is conditional, and often expensive. Staff intervention is inconsistent. Some officers intervene aggressively, others avoid involvement altogether. Neither approach creates safety. In environments where trust is absent, reporting violence can be more dangerous than enduring it. Complaints travel slowly if they travel at all. Retaliation is common. Records disappear. Witnesses recant. Silence becomes strategy. Medical neglect accelerates the damage. In the worst prisons, healthcare is reactive, not preventive. People are treated when conditions become emergencies. If they do, minor infections become serious, and treated injuries worsen. Chronic illnesses spiral. Requests for care are filtered through layers of approval. Delays are routine. Outside specialists are rarely authorized. Pain becomes background noise, not because it is rare but because it is expected. Mental health crises are especially dangerous here. Facilities unequipped for psychiatric care rely on containment instead of treatment. Self-harm is punished with isolation. Emotional breakdowns are treated as disciplinary issues. A person in distress is seen as a problem to control, not a patient to help. Suicide attempts are not uncommon. When they occur, investigations are internal, conclusions are administrative, lessons are rarely implemented. The environment does not change. In some of the worst prisons, Staffing shortages create unofficial lockdowns. Entire units remain confined to cells for days or weeks at a time. Meals are delayed or simplified. Showers are restricted. Recreation is suspended indefinitely. These lockdowns are framed as temporary safety measures, but they become routine. Time compresses. A person may spend 23 or 24 hours a day inside a concrete box with no clear explanation and no end date. The psychological toll compounds quickly. Death inside these prisons rarely looks dramatic. It is often slow, an untreated illness, a misdiagnosis, a delayed response. When someone dies, paperwork moves faster than care ever did. Notifications are made, reports are filed, operations continue, families receive brief explanations, rarely the full truth. Accountability is fragmented. Wardens point to policy. Officers point to staffing shortages. Medical contractors point to budgets. Agencies point to regulations. Responsibility dissolves across systems. No single failure appears large enough to demand reform. But the cumulative effect is devastating for those serving long or indefinite sentences. The future collapses into maintenance. There is no countdown, no milestone, no meaningful progression. Hope becomes risky. People learn not to expect improvement not because they don't want it, but because disappointment is too costly. Emotional numbing becomes survival. These environments do not just punish behavior. They reshape identity. Over time, people adapt in ways that make normal life unimaginable. Decisions are avoided. Initiative disappears. Emotional expression feels dangerous. The prison becomes the only reality that makes sense, and for the system, that adaptation is convenient, because a person who no longer expects a future is easier to manage. Yet the most disturbing aspect of these prisons is not what happens inside, it is what happens afterward, because some people are eventually released. And when they are, the system expects them to function as if none of this occurred, but that reckoning belongs to the next chapter. Release is often described as freedom. For people sentenced into America's worst prisons, release is something else entirely. It is exposure. After years, sometimes decades inside environments built on control, deprivation, and unpredictability. Freedom arrives without preparation. The gates open, paperwork is signed, a bus ticket is issued. And suddenly, the rules disappear. Inside the prison, every decision was made for them. When to wake up, when to eat, when to move, when to speak. Outside, choice returns all at once. And for many, that is terrifying. Simple tasks become overwhelming. Grocery stores feel chaotic. Traffic noise triggers panic. Crowds feel hostile. Silence feels unsafe. Eye contact feels like a threat. The world moves too fast. Freedom does not feel like relief. It feels like danger. Years spent in extreme confinement permanently alter how the brain responds to stress. Hypervigilance, once necessary for survival, becomes a constant state. The nervous system never fully powers down. Sleep becomes shallow or impossible. Nightmares replay confinement repeatedly. The body remains on alert even in safety. Former prisoners described feeling detached from reality, as if observing life from behind glass. They are present but not participating. Relationships suffer almost immediately. Families expect reunion and gratitude. What they encounter instead is emotional distance, irritability, and withdrawal. Loved ones struggle to understand why someone who survived so much seems unable to connect. The truth is difficult to explain. Connection was once dangerous. Trust was once costly. Vulnerability was once punished. Those instincts do not disappear when the sentence ends. Employment becomes another barrier. Gaps in work history are scrutinized. Education opportunities were limited or non-existent inside extreme facilities. Skills atrophy. Social interaction feels foreign. A job interview becomes an interrogation. Failure reinforces shame. Shame fuels isolation. Isolation mirrors the prison. Some begin to believe they function better inside confinement than outside it, and sometimes the system proves them right. Recidivism statistics are often cited as justification for harsh sentencing. What those numbers rarely acknowledge is causation. People released from psychologically damaging environments are expected to reintegrate without treatment, support, or understanding. When they struggle, the failure is labeled personal. But the damage was institutional. The system breaks people, then blames them for being broken. For those never released, those serving life sentences or dying inside, the consequences ripple outward. Families live with unresolved grief. Children grow up without parents, often without explanation. Communities absorb absence, trauma, and economic strain. The impact is generational. Entire neighborhoods carry the weight of sentences imposed decades earlier. Public awareness remains limited because these prisons operate out of sight. They are geographically isolated, administratively shielded, politically defended. The people inside lack platforms. Their experiences are filtered through reports, statistics, and carefully managed language. The narrative stays controlled. Reform efforts exist, but they face resistance. Isolation is defended as necessary. Neglect is framed as resource limitation. Violence is justified as security enforcement. Responsibility is dispersed across agencies, policies, and decades of precedent. No single decision appears cruel enough to demand accountability, but cruelty does not always come from intent. Sometimes it comes from tolerance. These prisons do not exist because the system failed. They exist because the system allows them to. Sentencing is supposed to balance accountability, deterrence, and rehabilitation. In the worst American prisons, all three collapse. Extreme confinement does not deter harm. Neglect does not promote responsibility. Psychological destruction does not prepare anyone for return. What remains is punishment for its own sake. And punishment without purpose becomes something else entirely. The question is not whether these prisons are harsh. The question is whether a society accepts environments that permanently damage human beings and then expects them to function as if nothing happened. Because once someone has been sentenced into the worst prisons in America, the sentence does not stay behind the walls. It follows them. In memory, in behavior, in silence, and for many, it lasts longer than any number written on paper.